Sometimes when high school students visit Washington, and it's my pleasure to welcome them, I ask them, what were the important things Washington did? And it's important for everybody to have your own list. Everybody can have lists. My suggestion often, just to start discussion, is that Washington did at least three very important things. Number one, he won the war. Number three, he made the presidency work. But in between, he did something of immense importance. He was what we would today call the chairman, what in those days they called the president of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia over a hot summer in 1787. The delegates to the Constitutional Convention from the various states were at odds over how powerful the federal government should be, over what the structure of the federal government would be. No one knew what the Constitution would or could or should look like. You can read in the minutes of the convention in Philadelphia that one of the delegates from South Carolina stands and addresses his colleagues and says, the differences between us are greater than the differences in Russia and Turkey. And it was true that they had very different interests. The New England shipping states, the states of the South had very different interests. And at some point, some of the delegates stood up and said the 18th century equivalent of, we're out of here. But Washington was presiding in a rather ornate chair. He said very little during the convention. But he would say, gentlemen, please stay. And you didn't walk out on the general. This was too great a man, too good a man of integrity and principle. You didn't leave. And so you stayed, and you stayed for 3 long months, and you finished the Constitution of the United States. That Washington did. If Washington had declined the presidency, then the what-ifs of history can begin to multiply in a very perplexing way. In my own view, the Constitution of the United States would not have survived had he declined to take the office. We knew, or the world then knew, that he respected the limits that ought to be placed on the power because he surrendered his commission at Annapolis. I think the framers were conscious of the fact that they did not have all the answers as to what makes for a just and decent government. If the framers thought that they knew all of the definition of what a just and complete and a just and perfect society is, they would have written down. They were more humble than that. They knew that wisdom is acquired over time. And so they used expansive words in the Constitution. In the Fifth Amendment, which was enacted as part of the Bill of Rights, which was an important gentleman's agreement that made the Constitution work, the founders of the Constitution, who helped write the Bill of Rights as well, used the words life, liberty, property. These are expansive words. They acquire meaning over time. And constitutions have to survive over time, and you have to understand them over time. It's important to think about and read the Constitution. If you try to sit down and read it over the evening, your mind will wander. It's unlike the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was designed to be read to the troops. And the more you read it, the more angry you get at King George. The Constitution you cannot read simply at a sitting, but you can consult it for questions. And it's true that the Constitution is distinguished for its brevity. But Article 1, which is the legislative power, and Article 2, which concerns the executive power, are quite strikingly different in their style. In Article 1, which talks about the legislative power, Congress has very specific powers. It can build post roads. It can raise money for an army and for a navy. It can regulate commerce among the several states. But when you look at Article 2, the sentences are much longer. The powers of the presidency aren't listed. You have to pick them out from the middle of a longer sentence. So the president has the executive power. Then you read a little further on, he's the commander-in-chief. You read a little further on, he can receive foreign diplomats, foreign ministers. And one of the reasons it was left vague, in my view and in the view of some others who have studied the Constitution, is they weren't sure what the presidency would look like, but they trusted George Washington to set the precedent by his actions and to set the precedent as the problems came up. One of the fascinating problems in the first term of Washington was this. The Senate provides that the president's appointments are confirmed by the Senate for high officials. What happens if the president then decides to fire one of those officials? The Senate said, well, if some members of the Senate said, well, if we can and must confirm the appointment, surely we must be a party to the decision to fire that person. If that view had prevailed, our government would have been very different. We would have been much more like a parliamentary system. But Washington thought that this undercut the important powers of the president, the power of the president to command, in military terms, to determine the course of action in civilian terms of lower officials. Washington himself went to the Senate to hear those debates, and the administration prevailed by, I think, just 1 or 2 votes. This was very close, but Washington's strength and resolve was necessary to make the presidency work, and this is just one example. Article 2 of the Constitution refers to, defines, sets forth the executive power. By comparison with Article 1 in the Constitution, it is short. That brevity, that generality, that non-specificity in Article 2 was both a challenge and an opportunity, I think, for the first president. A challenge because it was somewhat obscure as to what his powers were. An opportunity by his interpretation of those powers and because of his character and his principle to both set forth the powers of the president and to respect those limits. Some have surmised, and it seems to me there's considerable merit to this position, that the framers, number one, had spent so much of their energy, so much of their intellectual and political capital in defining the 3 branches of government and in talking about the powers of the national government versus the state, that they were content to allow the presidency to evolve. And they had particular confidence in doing so because there was a general assumption that George Washington would be the first president. They trusted his judgment, they trusted his intellect, and above all, they trusted his character. Article 2 of the Constitution does not mention the word cabinet, does not mention the word Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State. All of this was to be designed for the necessities of the time. And it's interesting that some of the people that Washington respected the most, Jefferson was the Secretary of State, Hamilton the Secretary of the Treasury. These were the people around whom he built the first administration, and those positions, and that also the Attorney General, still have survived as being principal structures of the American national government. With him for authority. So Washington had close associates, but not for long. And later in his career, after he was president, Jefferson, Madison, Randolph were at odds with the president. And so he knew really the limitations of power. And he was sensitive to that. And that's one reason, it seems to me, that he thought it so important to have a governmental structure that could survive the animosities and the rivalries that naturally exist among politicians and between powerful people. Every great commander knows the limits of power. If you give an order, maybe some people are not going to carry it out. Why do they carry it out? They respect your judgment, they respect your intellect, they respect your character, they respect your acknowledgement of the necessities that made for that order. But he knew that power had its limitations. He knew, as most Americans knew, I think, that Peter the Great and the King of Sweden had been engaged in a tremendous struggle at the opening of the century. Just 1763 was the end of the 7 Years' War, when the Bourbon dynasty, the Georgian Hanoverian dynasty, King Frederick, Catherine, Maria Theresa, had been competing for power. Americans didn't want to be in a system where their young men had to die in the field of battle in order to vindicate one personality over another. They wanted none of that. They wanted to pursue a life where politics and statesmen and competing statesmen were not an important part of their history, of their purpose, of their meaning as a nation. Washington was uninterested in dynasty. There is some speculation that that is why the Constitution requires that the president be 35 years old. They did not want to have an infant king with a guardian. Separation of powers is designed to ensure that each branch of the government, legislative, executive, judicial, has certain authority of its own. The president's the commander-in-chief. The Congress must pass revenue bills. The Senate, the judiciary has a life tenure. These are separation of powers designed to allow them to exercise their power. Checks and balances works the other way. It's so that the branches of the government can work together. And that has to happen to some extent for the government to work. And Washington was good about listening to the comments of the Senate and considering, and of the House of Representatives, and considering their views and the views of the public in making his policies. Washington interpreted the Constitution to allow the bank is of immense importance. People sometimes think the Constitution is for a bunch of lawyers. It's not. The Constitution is yours. Washington wasn't a lawyer. Eisenhower wasn't a lawyer. Reagan wasn't a lawyer. You don't have to be a lawyer to be the president. You don't have to be the lawyer to have the duty to interpret the Constitution. Presidents have the duty to interpret the Constitution. And it was Washington's interpretation that a Bank of the United States was not only permitted, but necessary and proper. Now, Washington was in an excellent position to interpret the Constitution of the United States. I think if it had not been for Washington, there would be no Constitution of the United States as we know it. Well, Washington, because he was at Philadelphia and because he was the president of the convention and was a participant in all of the debates, had great influence in his interpretation of the Constitution. And when a person such as Washington, who did not believe that power should be unlimited, interpreted the Constitution in a particular way, that had great force and great meaning for the American people. As a political matter, I suppose people will still argue that the Bank of the United States was a bad idea even then. I haven't read the economic historian's judgment on it, but of course that was a difficult political matter. But as a constitutional matter, Washington's view has carried the day, and the Supreme Court of the United States endorsed that view in the case involving the bank. The case is called Mcculloch versus Maryland, and it's a good case to read. Remember, the fact that the president gives an interpretation of the Constitution is itself entitled to great weight. The fact that the Congress of the United States gives them an interpretation of the Constitution is entitled to great weight. They're on the scene, they're on the spot, they know what the country needs. So courts must be very deferential to the interpretation of the Constitution given the political branches. Ultimately, because the courts are last in line, the courts have the duty to say, emphatically, the duty to say what the law means. Again, I think we know that a president has an obligation to preserve the Constitution. And you don't preserve the Constitution by misinterpreting it. You don't preserve the Constitution by overreaching. And Washington, by his character and his example and his life, demonstrated that in a very real way. Well, if we talk about inevitability, I think Washington would be quite cautious. He was a student of human behavior, and he knew humans could make mistakes. And he knew that you had to seize the moment at the right time. Now, it is true that Washington referred to Providence, and it does seem to me that the framers of the Constitution knew they were on the stage of world history. I think they sensed that. We were remarkably fortunate, remarkably gifted, remarkably blessed to have men of that character, men of such intellect and resolve at Philadelphia in 1787. I think the Constitution was in part accident, in part design, in part providence. But the fact that there's a debate over what the Constitution means doesn't mean the Constitution is defective. It means it's strong. It's strong because it invites debate. It wants debate. A democracy cannot survive unless it has the knowledge that its duty is to plan, shape its own destiny. We have the right to plan and shape our destiny in our own time. But that requires a people that reveres the Constitution, that understands it, that participates in politics in a rational, thoughtful, decent, civil way.